This news is funded by viewers like you. Please support our work at democracynow.org/give. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Vigils and memorials were held across the globe Monday and this weekend on the first anniversary of October 7th to mourn Israelis and Palestinians who've been killed over the past year. The anniversary comes as Israel's widening its assault on Gaza and sending more troops into Lebanon. Today, we spend the hour with the acclaimed writer, the journalist, Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of the new book, The Message, based in part on a trip he took last year to the occupied West Bank in Israel. Ta-Nehisi compares Israel's apartheid system to that of Jim Crow here in the United States. He writes, "It occurred to me that there was still one place on the planet under American patronage that resembled the world that my parents were born into." In his book, Ta-Nehisi Coates also writes about traveling to Senegal, where he visited the slave trade memorial at Gorée Island, and going to South Carolina, where school officials tried to ban his book, Between the World and Me, which won the National Book Award in 2015. The Message is written as a letter to his students at Howard University, where Ta-Nehisi Coates is the Sterling Brown Endowed Chair in the English department. The Message is Ta-Nehisi's first collection of nonfiction work since his 2017 book, We Were 8 Years in Power, an American Tragedy. Ta-Nehisi, welcome back to Democracy Now! Last time during the pandemic, you were in another studio, so it's great to be with you in our New York studio. I wanted to read one of your quotes. "We're plagued by dead language and dead stories that serve people whose aim is nothing short of a dead world. It's not enough to stand against these dissemblers. There has to be something in you, something that hungers for clarity. You'll need that hunger because if you follow that path soon enough, you'll find yourself confronting not just their myths, not just their stories, but your own." Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Message. We're going to talk a lot about what's happening in the occupied territories in Gaza, in the West Bank. But I wanted to start where you go in The Message first, and that is to Senegal.
Right.
Talk about this journey that you actually took with great trepidation.
I did. As you said, we'll spend a lot of time talking about the occupied territories in Israel and the West Bank, but it's good to start here because the two parts are kind of paired to each other. African Americans are a group of people who have lived under the weight of artifice, a creation, a kind of mythology of what Africa is in our minds. If all of the myths of racism, all the justifications for enslavement, all the justifications for Jim Crow, at the end of the day, they have their origins in these constructions of Africa as this savage place, the idea that, having been brought here, we're better off. Very, very typical of, colonizing and conquering a movement. And one of the things we've done to push back is create our own narratives, our own journeys, our own ideas of what Africa is. My very name comes out of that, which I'm very uncomfortable with, as I talk about in the book. And
talk about it.
Oh boy, oh Lord. I wrote it. I should be very comfortable talking about it. I was born in 1975. And that was a period in time coming out of Black Power, coming out of, Black is beautiful, like really discovering this idea that our sense of beauty, our nose, our lips, our names, our hair, that we had the right to take control over that, including our history. And so my name is an ancient Egyptian name that refers to the ancient kingdom of Nubia. The notion was that, put very, very crudely, that if the West had its kings and queens, if it had its great monuments, if it had its great ideas, so did we. And part of growing older, part of, and I actually talk about this in Between the World and Me, part of becoming a writer, actually, is like, our job is to be skeptical of clean stories. And I learned that very, very early on. And the message is kind of a continuation of that. Of course, the ultimate, I would say, I guess, climax in that journey is going to see the continent itself. And moving past myth, moving past the idea of constructed narratives, even when they're liberatory, even when they're emancipationist, to see the people themselves. And that is what took me to Dakar. And that is what I think took so long for me to go to Dakar.
And in terms of what most surprised you in the trip, could you talk about that?
Yeah, what most surprised me is the thing that will not surprise any African American watching this interview. It was my deep sorrow. It was my deep, deep, deep sorrow. And I think, like, much of what I just said in answer to Amy's question, I'd already intellectualized before I went. And so I was already thinking about this, but thinking about something and being confronted with it is a totally, totally different thing. As a great Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they got punched. And as soon as that plane started descending out of the clouds over Dakar and I saw the buildings rising up, I was being punched. It is one thing to think about the Middle Passage, to think about your ancestors theoretically. It is quite another to literally sit on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean and look out and understand that this was, even if only symbolically, last stop.
And when you went to Gorée, you decided that you did not want to have any of the tour guides. You wanted to wander around on your own.
No, but
talk about that experience.
By then it was like day 3, and so I understood that as much as I thought I was going to see the continent, I was actually going to see some sort of departed version of myself, from hundreds of years ago. I was walking with ghosts the whole time, and I didn't want to be talked to. My family is from the eastern shore of Maryland, not too far from Ocean City, for anybody who knows that geography. It's like right on the Atlantic Ocean. And so to get back to Senegal, to get to Dakar, which is itself right on the tip of the continent, I would look out and I would have these moments and I would say, my God, you know what I mean? There's part of me all the way on the other side, and there's part of me that's here. And so, again, Gorée is a place that has a lot of story and a lot of myth around it. And I read about that. I thought I was fully prepared. But I'm going to tell you, brother, you get on that boat and that boat pulls off and you think about all of your ancestors. And it was 7 a.m. in the morning and I was alone on that boat. And it is a very, very different experience.
And back to your name, Ta-Nehisi,
yes.
And also which goes to your parents as well,
yes.
And how their influence on you. Your dad, a former Black Panther, ran a publishing press right in your house.
Yeah. No, and I think like what they were really trying to do, and this actually goes to the core of what the book is about. How do you tell your own story? How do you free yourself from a history, from novels, from film, from television, an entire architecture that is designed to tell you that you are exactly where you belong because of who you are, because of what you are, either because of your genes, because God said, you belong there. How do you construct something different? And one of the things I'm trying to confront in the book is, I think perhaps step 1 is almost to make a mirror image of the people that have put you in that situation. Well, you say we're this, we're actually that. But I think one of the most difficult things is to free yourself entirely of that structure and to construct your own morality, your own stories, your own ideas that don't necessarily depend on those who have put you in the situation to begin with.
And the structure of your book is addressed to your students at Howard. The decision to choose that form for your book?
To be honest with you, I've not said this anywhere, I was very worried about that because I'd done that, like I'd written this letter in Between the World and Me, and I thought people could get, oh my God, he's gonna do this again, Between the World and Me again. But the fact of the matter is I am always trying to achieve intimacy with the reader. That's the the primary job. I would tell my students all the time, look, you are dealing with readers who could be doing anything else. They could be on their smartphones, they could be playing video games, they could be watching movies, they could be watching TV, they could be somewhere making love. They could be doing anything but reading you. And so you have a responsibility to make them feel a sense of intimacy and immediacy. And I was lucky in the sense that, these were very, very real conversations that I'd had with my students, so I had something to pull from, and also, the fact of just the letter form allowed me to do that. It allows me to get, you know, a kind of intimacy with my reader.
Talk about George Orwell, Why I Write, and
that's a great essay.
Connecting politics and language in the promise you made to your students at Howard. Between the World and Me was written to your son Samari, this to the students.
Yeah. So we usually start actually with politics in the English language. That's the first essay that I have them read. You know, just to think about language as a political thing. You know, we live in this world where I feel that oftentimes we are taught, not that everybody subscribes to this, that art lives over here and politics lives over here. And that politics itself is actually very, very limited. That, you know, it happens every 2 or 4 years. It's in the voting booth. It's who you decide, you know, to vote for. It's what issues you decide to activate on. But one of the arguments that I make in the message is that there's an entire architecture outside of the world of mean politics that determines how politicians actually talk, the choices they give, you know, et cetera. Why does Kamala Harris feel the need, for instance, to say that she has a gun? What is that actually based on? And I would say it is based on archetypes of femininity. I would say it's based on archetypes of race, archetypes of the cowboy. And where do those archetypes come from? They come from our art, they come from our literature, they come from our film, our TVs, our commercials, you know, and at their base, they ultimately come from writing, because somebody has to write those ultimately. And in that world, things that seem separated from politics never really are. And so I wanted to start that book, or this book, The Message, with that Orwell quote, because that's like one of the things he kind of is obsessing with in that essay. And at the same time, there's this beautiful tension that I often feel, which is in a different world, you know, he would just write beautiful stories. He would just play with language for the hell of playing with language. But he doesn't live in that world. And I don't feel that my students live in that world. They live in a world of as we'll talk about, genocide, apartheid, segregation, global warming, you know, Category 5 hurricanes, you know, flood on one coast, fire on the other. These are immediate issues. And I don't believe that they as writers, we as writers, have the luxury of sort of sitting back in our salons and in our living rooms, you know, simply constructing beautiful language for the hell of constructing beautiful language. It has to be engaged with something.
From Senegal, you take us to Columbia, South Carolina. Why that choice?
Well, I was writing this in a time where this wave of book bannings was happening. And I always wanted to write about that, but I felt that I was worried about making the writer the center of the book banning, because even though the work is directed at the writer is actually not the person that suffers under the book ban. The teachers suffer under the book ban. It's the teachers who are under threat for losing their job. It's the teachers who get harassed. It's the librarians who are under threat of losing their jobs. It's the librarians who get harassed. It's the students who lose the ability to have access to different worlds and different ways of thinking. And I was trying to figure out how I could write this in such a way so that I would not be the center of it. Luckily, you know, I ended up in conversation with a teacher by the name of Mary Wood. From Chapin, South Carolina, went to Chapin High School, where she teaches, and where she was trying to teach Between the World and Me, and got into some amount of trouble for that. And she invited me down, you know, just to, you know, go to a hearing, and that's what I did. And it was quite eventful. It was not the world that I expected. It was not the audience I expected. It was interesting to see how much support actually was rallied behind her, even though she's in a deep red area, in a deep red state. And so that too is about the power of stories. That too is about the power of narratives, the questions we ask and the questions we don't.
You write in the message about this experience in South Carolina. I see politicians in Colorado and Tennessee and South Carolina moving against my own work, tossing books I've authored out of libraries, banning them from classes. I feel snatched out of the present and dropped into an age of pitchforks and book-burning bonfires. My first instinct is to laugh, but then I remember that American history is filled with men and women who were as lethal as they were ridiculous. Right. Now, if
you got one running for president right now, you know, lethal and ridiculous.
Well, you talk about the area you were in, 70-30 split, 70% for Trump, and yet, and this is what you were just talking about, this 30%, how surprised you were by the minority, the power of it when it's mobilized.
Yeah, you know, it's like one of these things, like, again, like this goes back to how we construct language. It's either a blue or red district, right? Even purple doesn't quite like carry the quite, you know, like the real connotation. So you think it's red, okay, battle's over, why am I here? You know, but 30% and 30% activated around an actual issue is actually a lot of people, you know what I mean? And it was like I could not have known that without seeing it. Like you have to, and this is like one of the messages I have, you know, for my students in the book. You have to walk the land. You can't, you know, sit on your butt reading reports, you know what I mean? And even reading books like this one and say, hey, I'm gonna be a writer. You have to have actual experiences. So I have to walk in that room, you know, and meet this, you know, white woman in her 70s, you know, who tells me in the wake of George Floyd, we organized a reading group at our church for Black authors. And I love Colson Whitehead. Oh my God, have you read him? You know, like I have to have that experience with somebody, you know, I have to have that shock, you know? And so I just feel like it was like really, really important in the message to actually model the work that I was articulating, or model the lessons that I was actually articulating for my students. When
you just referred to President Trump, can you elaborate further?
He looks ridiculous, but he is in fact quite lethal, you know? And I think certainly in 2016, there was great temptation to laugh. You know what I mean? You hear these things, you know, you hear him say certain things, you know, you see him, you know, in certain places, and there's a kind of dismissiveness. But what we actually are dismissing is a kind of darkness that I think lurks deep within all of us and can actually be appealed to. It's not comfortable to say that you can win through hate. It's not comfortable to say that you can win through anger. It's not comfortable to say historically it actually has been very effective at, you know, electorally to pick out weak people or people who are not in, you know, the most advantaged political space and to demonize them and use them as a tool. That actually has been quite effective for people in pursuit of power. We would rather think that good wins all the time, that people see the best in each other. It reifies our notions of what America is, our stories that we tell ourselves of what America is, but it doesn't correspond with the actual history and the truth.